everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mary Chris, and for today's video we are going to continue my Booktube series. I know I checked my creator studio, my YouTube, and the last time I did this was in April, so April, May, June, 2 months. I'm definitely very sad that it took me that long to get back to it, because for this Booktube, especially for this series, it's a little bit more intense for me because English is my second language, so I have to read it over again and making sure that I have the proper information and thoughts. And I think that's about it. Let's get started. And this Booktube is definitely, even if it takes me quite a bit, well, I'm gonna try my best not to have, at least I want to do this every week, because this year one of the things that I want to improve upon is get back to reading. So it's A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn, chapter 5. Let's get started. Okay, so chapter 5 is, of course, I'm on the wrong chapter, of course. Okay. Chapter 5, A Kind of Revolution. Let's get started. This chapter starts by Howard Zinn explaining that the revolution was won because of the well-armed white middle class and the lower middle class. The elites needed the armed middle and lower middle class whites because the black slaves and Indians were excluded. The lower and middle class whites, however, saw this as an opportunity to climb the social ladder. I want to read a paragraph from page 79. Okay, let's do it. The military conflict itself, by dominating everything in its time, diminished other issues, made people choose sides in the contest that was publicly important, forced people onto the side of revolution whose interest in independence was not at all obvious. Ruling elites seem to have learned through the generations, consciously or not, that the war makes them more secure against internal trouble. One thing also that one of the reasons why I really want to read this is because this is still a very much important and prevalent. No, this is very much not prevalent. What's that word I'm looking for? It's still very current. I'll put it here somewhere if I remember, but it applies to our situation now politically. So it's very important to learn history. Isn't this so amazingly similar tactics that elites do now? Wars continue to go on in a facade of liberation, but if we look deeply into them, it is all about gaining more power, money, control, and a great distraction. Who fights for these wars for the elites? The poor and the middle class of our society. In the military, the promise of a free post-secondary education is so tempting. One would hope that by joining the army and completing their service, that they would then pursue the careers of their choosing. However, the mental health issue as well as the physical are not taken into account, that one might not even be able to pursue that college education due to mental or physical disabilities, and compensation are either insufficient or non-existent. The Americans lost a lot of their battles against the British Army at first, but with the help of the French monarchy, who wanted revenge against the British, the Americans finally succeeded. I will again refer to the book, page 79 to 80. The Americans lost the first battles of war. Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, the Deep South. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton. And then, in Turning Point, a big battle at Saratoga, New York in 1777. Washington's frozen army hung on at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, while Benjamin Franklin negotiated an alliance with the French monarchy, which was anxious for revenge on England. The war turned on the South, where the British won victory after victory until the Americans, aided by a large French army with the French Navy, blocking off the British from supplies and reinforcements, won the final victory of the war at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. After the Revolution, the class divide prevailed. The black slaves were not free. Indians were still fighting for their land. Certain loyalists kept their land, but the winners were people like Benjamin Franklin. Edmund Morgan sums up the class nature of revolution this way. The fact that the lower ranks were involved in the contest should not obscure the fact that the contest itself was generally a struggle for office and power between members of an upper class, the new against the established. Looking at the situation after the revolution, Richard Morris comments, "Everyone finds inequality. He finds we the people of United States," a phrase coined by the very rich Governor Morris, did not mean Indians or black or women or white servants. In fact, there were more indentured servants than ever, and the revolution did nothing to end and little to ameliorate white bondage. Carl Degler says, out of our past, no new social class came to power through the door of the American Revolution. The men who engineered the revolt were largely members of the colonial ruling class. George Washington was the richest man in America. John Hancock was a prosperous Boston merchant. Benjamin Franklin was a wealthy printer, and so on. On the other hand, town mechanics, laborers, and seamen, as well as the small farmers, were swept into the people by the rhetoric of the revolution, by the camaraderie of military service, by the distribution of some land. Thus was created a substantial body of support and national consensus, something that even with exclusion of ignored and oppressed people could be called America. America in quotation. Quote, "We, the people of the United States," end quote, did not include the Indians. What did the revolution mean to the Native Americans, the Indians? They had been ignored by the fine words of the Declaration, had not been considered equal, certainly not in choosing those who would govern the American territories in which they lived, nor in being able to pursue the happiness as they had pursued it for centuries before the white Europeans arrived. Now with the British out of the way, the Americans could begin inexorable process of pushing the Indians off their land, killing them if they resisted. In short, as Francis Jennings puts it, the white Americans were fighting against British imperial control in the East, and for their own imperialism in the West. Before the Revolution, the Indians had been subdued by force in Virginia and in New England. Elsewhere, they had worked out modes of coexistence with colonies, but around 1750, with the colonial population growing fast, the pressure to move westward onto new land set the stage for conflict with the Indians. Land agents from the east began appearing in Ohio River Valley on the territory of a confederation of tribes called the Covenant Chain, for which the Iroquois were spokesmen. In New York, through intricate swindling, 800,000 acres of Mohawk had been taken, ending the period of Mohawk-New York friendship. Chief Hendrick of the Mohawk is recorded speaking his bitterness to the governor of George Clinton and Provincial Council of New York in 1753. The situation of the black slaves as a result of the American Revolution was more complex. Thousands of blacks fought with the British. 5,000 were the revolutionaries, most of them from the North, but there were also free blacks from Virginia and Maryland. The lower South was reluctant to arm blacks amid the urgency and chaos of war. Thousands took their freedom, leaving the British ships at the end of the war to settle in England, Nova Scotia, the West Indies, or Africa. Many others stayed in America as free blacks, invading their masters. When I was growing up, the United States was on the pedestal and the bastion of liberty and democracy. To many Americans, over the years, the Constitution drawn up in 1787 has seemed a work of genius, put together by wise, humane men who created a legal framework for democracy and equality. This view is stated a bit extravagantly by the historian George Bancroft, writing in the early 19th century. The Constitution establishes nothing that interferes with equality and individuality. It knows nothing of differences by descent or opinions, of favored classes or legalized religion, or the political power of property. It leaves the individual alongside of the individual, as a sea is made up of drops and American society is composed of separate, free, and constantly moving atoms, ever in reciprocal action, so that the institution and the laws of the country rise out of the masses of individual thought which, like the waters of the oceans, are rolling evermore. Another view of the Constitution was put forward early in the 20th century by the historian Charles Beard, arousing anger and indignation, including a denunciatory editorial in the New York Times. He wrote in his book An Economic Interpretation of Constitution. Inasmuch as the primary object of a government, beyond the mere representation of fiscal violence, the making of the rules which determine the property of relations of members of society, the dominant classes whose rights are thus to be determined must perforce obtain from the government such rules are consonant with the larger interests necessary to continuance of their economic process, or they must themselves control the organs of government. In short, Beard said, the rich must, in their own interest, either control the government directly or control the laws by which government operates. Beard applied this general idea to the Constitution by studying the economic backgrounds and political ideas of the 55 men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draw up the Constitution. He found that a majority of them were lawyers by profession, that most of them were men of wealth in land, slaves, manufacturing, or shipping, that half of them had money loaned out at interest, and that 40 of the 55 held government bonds according to the records of the Treasury Department. Thus, Beard found that most of the makers of the Constitution had some direct economic interest in establishing a strong federal government. The manufacturers needed protective tariffs. The moneylenders wanted to stop the use of paper money to pay off debts. The land speculators wanted protection as they invaded Indian lands. Slave owners needed federal security against the slave revolts, and runaways. Bondholders wanted a government able to raise money by a nationwide taxation to pay off those bonds. Four groups, Beard noted, were not represented in the Constitutional Convention: slaves, indentured servants, women, and men without property. And so the Constitution did not reflect the interests of those groups. He wanted to make it clear that he did not think the Constitution was written merely to the benefit of founding fathers personally, although one could not ignore the 150,000 fortune of Benjamin Franklin, the connections of Alexander Hamilton to wealthy interests through his father-in-law and brother-in-law, the great slave plantations of James Madison, the enormous land holdings of George Washington. Rather, it was to benefit the group of founders represented the economic interests they understood and felt in concrete, definite form through their own personal experience. Not everyone at Philadelphia Convention fitted Beard's scheme. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was a holder of landed property, and yet he opposed the ratification of the Constitution. Similarly, Luther Martin of Maryland, whose ancestors had obtained large tracts of land in New Jersey, opposed ratification. But with a few exceptions, Beard found a strong connection between wealth and the support of the Constitution. The manifestation of this inequality was the Shays' Rebellion. By 1787, there was not only a positive need for a strong central government to protect the large economic interests, but also an immediate fear of the rebellion by the discontented farmers. The chief event causing their fear was an uprising in the summer of 1786 in western Massachusetts, known as the Shays' Rebellion. In the western towns of Massachusetts, there was resentment against the legislature in Boston. The new Constitution of 1780 had raised the property qualifications for voting. No one could hold state office without being wealthy. The powers that once again passed legislations to quell rebellion. Sam Adams helped draw up a riot act and a resolution suspending habeas corpus to allow the authorities to keep people in jail without trial. At the same time, the legislature moved to make some concessions to the angry farmers, saying certain old taxes now be paid in goods instead of money. Were the founding fathers wise and just men trying to achieve a good balance? In fact, they did not want balance except one which kept things as they were. A balance among the dominant forces at that time. They certainly did not want an equal balance between slaves and masters, propertyless and property holders, Indians and whites. As many as half the people were not even considered by the founding fathers as among Balin's contending powers in society. They were not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. They were absent in the Constitution. They were invisible in the new political democracy. They were the women of early America. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you're a book lover like me, please don't forget to subscribe, like, comment on what is your favorite history book, and if you have any recommendations for me, and share to our fellow book lovers. That was a really interesting chapter, just kind of basically Howard Zinn breaking down that he's not saying the people who wrote the founding fathers wrote the Constitution unnecessarily bad, but of course they're going to make it so that it benefits the people that they know. They've never lived a life where they were hungry and poor, and so they're not gonna have the constitutions to benefit those people, but to benefit themselves. And these people, the founding fathers, were like one of the wealthiest people of that time, so they had a really, good idea making the Constitution. But basically he's just explaining that even back then, you couldn't even vote. You couldn't even vote if you don't have any property. You don't have a vote at all. And even now in the United States, people are being stripped of their voting rights. And that's something I want to discuss in the future, but for now, that's why I said, like, this book unfortunately is still so relevant, and the things that are happening before, like in this history, in this timeline, Indians are fighting for their lands, and until now they're still doing that, and their treaties are constantly being violated. So sometimes we're like, oh my gosh, the times are so bad now. No, it's been kind of happening. It's like history repeating itself. So I think one way for history not to repeat itself is so hopefully we can all get educated on what is really going on, because a lot of this stuff, I'm constantly mind blown by Howard Zinn. And of course, after this, I want to read more history, but this is like my baby step. Anyways, I think that's about it. We'll see you in my next video. Mwah! Bye!